Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm Stephanie Plunkett, Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the Norman Rockwell Museum, and we are so pleased that you're able to join us for this Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies exploration of the art of fantasy inspired by fairy tales and mythology. This special program is created in conjunction with our current exhibition, Enchanted, a history of fantasy illustration, which will be on view through October 31st here at the Norman Rockwell Museum. We have a wonderful program for you this morning, and that actually begins with a little bit of a sweep in looking at the art of Norman Rockwell and his own flights of fantasy, with a talk that I'm going to give called Real and Imagined, Fantastical Rockwell. And that will be followed by two panels. Our first will begin at 10:45 and go to 11:45, called The Fairy Tale and Fantasy Art with author and folklorist Jane Yolen and illustrator Ruth Sanderson. And our second panel will begin at 12 o'clock and go until about 1, and that is called The Making of Myths with artists Victo Ngai, Justin Gerard, and Iain McCaig. So we are going to get started, and I'm just going to begin sharing my screen so that we can look at a little bit of Rockwell. And if you do wind up having questions along the way, please do not hesitate to put your questions in the chat. I'm going to actually start with a George Lucas quote, which is, Rockwell recorded our fantasies and ideals and gave us a sense of what was in our heads and our hearts. An ardent and perceptive observer, Norman Rockwell was a persuasive visual commentator whose realist paintings for popular periodicals inspired belief by millions in the innate goodness of humanity and the achievability of the American dream. Nurturing our love of fantasy in ways that the artist himself may not have fully perceived, his carefully constructed illustrations for the Saturday Evening Post and other magazines, and for hundreds of 20th century advertisers and products, are the work of a consummate myth maker who understood his audience's deepest desires and spoke to them from the heart. And you're seeing him here in his Stockbridge, Massachusetts studio, which is on the museum's grounds. As art critic Peter Sheldall aptly noted, Rockwell's precisely observed facts squared with deeply serious hopes, and his pictures constitute an accurate graph, as we have, of what being an American, a fictive condition always, could feel like. Despite the complications of life, or perhaps because of them, Rockwell pictured a world that he and many others wished to inhabit. His recurring motifs, children enjoying the company of their elders, patient parents, newsy but benevolent neighbors, as we see here, resourceful girls and women, and later principled freedom fighters, reflected mores that society embraced but sometimes fell short of fulfilling. Embedded within his humor and pathos were conceptions of heroism, patriotism, individuality, and equality, ideals that have helped sustain us in good times and bad. His artworks, though realist, portrayed ideas rather than actualities. And it is perhaps no surprise that Rockwell's psychoanalyst, Erik Erikson, who is seen here, observed that the artist painted his happiness, pouring his energy into whatever happened to be on his easel at the time. Storytelling was Rockwell's passion, as well as a shield against uncertainty and despair. For 60 years, his willfully hopeful constructions, aspirational fantasies, celebrated commonalities, and helped us to galvanize America by envisioning its dreams and desires, as with these World War II covers featuring the fictional hero, Willie Gillis. Film directors George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, who have explored themes of fantasy and science fiction in their work, are both admirers of Rockwell's narratives and collectors of his art. Washington Post film critic Anne Hornaday once remarked that the two directors' movies have tapped into the mass audience's most fundamental hunger for archetype and myth, an observation that could likewise be applied to Rockwell. Committed to entertainment, these three master storytellers offer something more profound. Early in my career, Rockwell said, I discovered that funny ideas, pure gags, were good, but funny ideas with pathos were better. Not only pathos, though, he said, just something deeper. An idea which is only humorous doesn't stay with people. But if the situation depicted has some overtones or undertones, something beyond humor, it sticks with people and they like it much more. Rockwell's love of fantasy was first inspired by literature. Many of his artworks feature men and boys engrossed in reading, like the young man in this 1923 boy reading adventure story, highlighting the importance of literature as a source of inspiration generally, and to Rockwell personally throughout his life. Captivated by the stories of Charles Dickens, which his father read out loud in the evenings after dinner, Rockwell was inspired as a boy to draw their characters as he listened. His father read, he said, in an even, colorless voice, the book laid flat before him to catch the light, the full light of the lamp, the muffled voices of the city, the rumble of a cart, and a shout becoming the sounds of the London streets. As a lifelong reader of Dickens, Rockwell adopted the author's literary view, observing the world around him for its rich narratives and characterizations. By his own report, Rockwell's parents supported his decision to attend art school after seeing an impressive drawing of Ebenezer Scrooge, the cold-hearted miser who eventually finds redemption, which was created as he listened to a reading of A Christmas Carol. In the 1920s and 30s, Saturday Evening Post cover illustrations by Rockwell and his friend and chief competitor, J.C. Leyendecker, promoted a fantastic holiday-themed symbolism, showcasing jolly, plausible Santas, posh, religiously inspired costume pieces, and Old English scenes infused with literary overtones. One of these, Rockwell's December 17, 1938 cover painting, which the Post titled Mr. Pickwick Sets Out by the Muggleton Coach for Christmas at Dingley Dell, features another of Dickens' well-known characters. A retired businessman described as a generous and affluent gentleman, Samuel Pickwick, was the founder and chairman of the Pickwick Club. Written for serialized publication and later compiled and sold as one story, the Pickwick Papers tells of the club's members who travel around England by coach to examine specimens of human life in places remote from London. In Rockwell's painting, the beloved protagonist is portrayed with an overflowing basket of holiday bounty. As a fledgling professional, fresh from his studies at New York's Art Students League, Rockwell gained entry to the publishing world at McBride, Nast and Company. Many fiction-based assignments for children's magazines followed, including a series of 5 illustrations for Ralph Henry Barber's story, The Magic Football, a fairy tale of today. This was published in St. Nicholas magazine in December 1914. Despite its fantastical underpinnings, the story must have rung true for Rockwell. Principal character Billy Piper, like Rockwell, was not known for his athletic prowess, but had daydreams of being a star football player. Responding to the boy's impassioned wish, a spindly fairy, who you see here, emerges to give Billy a magic football to aid him in his quest. In Rockwell's illustration, this flight of imagination is set against a realistic setting, a well-appointed sitting room filled with books, art prints, sculpture, brushes, pens, and ink bottles. Over the mantel hang a Rembrandt-like Burgomaster and what appears to be a copy of Millet's 1857 painting, The Gleaners, featuring 3 women toiling over the remaining stalks of wheat in a field after harvest. At the end of the story, Billy wins the big game for his team to much acclaim, but also experiences, quote, a sorrow. The magic football is gone, indicating that next time, talent and effort alone will be his salvation. Also something that probably rang true to Rockwell. The Land of Enchantment, another Rockwell flight of fantasy, inspired by works of classic fiction, appeared in December 22nd, in the December 22nd, 1934 issue of the Saturday Evening Post, though it was not originally intended for publication. Conceived for a commission Rockwell received from a man who wished to hang a picture over the mantel of his children's room, the project was curtailed when the financial crash of 1929 forced the client to cancel his order. But the Post encouraged Rockwell to develop the idea, his first double-page spread for the magazine, which could be clipped out for framing. At the time, Rockwell lived in New Rochelle, New York, and displayed the painting in the town's library, where it continues to hang for public enjoyment, and it's actually on view at the museum right now. It's really fun to have it on the walls. In this rare mural-sized painting, Rockwell contrasts the worlds of fantasy and reality by surrounding 2 children boldly painted in the foreground, engrossed in their books, against a paler backdrop of slowly emerging storybook characters. He further distinguishes figures from background by echoing the children's posture with 2 strong diagonal thrusts, subtly designed, that begin just above their heads and flow outward to the lower corners of the art. Carefully inscribed around the canvas perimeter are the names of many beloved characters from fairy tales and fantasy, from Old King Cole to Rip Van Winkle, Alice in Wonderland, Little Red Riding Hood, Robinson Crusoe, and The Cat and the Fiddle. Decades later at the Post, whimsy was still the order of the day, as evidenced in the 1955 cover illustration Art Critic, which happily is in the Norman Rockwell Museum's collection. In a recurring Rockwell motif, fantasy and reality exchange places as paintings in a gallery literally come to life. Despite Rockwell's use of what is referred to in cinematography as deep focus, when foreground and background objects take on equal clarity to create a sense of hyperrealism, the artist's imagination has clearly taken the lead. Rockwell once said he envied students who swooned when viewing the Mona Lisa because he never felt such passion. Perhaps he viewed himself as a more analytical artist, like the one examining a 17th century portrait in Art Critic. With typical humor, he replaced the indignant woman portrayed in his charcoal study with one more alluring in the portrait frame. Rubens inspired by a drawing of that Peter Paul Rubens made of his first wife, Isabella Brandt, and by Rockwell's photography of his own wife, Mary Barstow Rockwell. To further enliven the piece, a quiet landscape in the background has been supplanted by a group of Dutch cavaliers, which you can actually see here. He wasn't getting quite enough activity from that beautiful landscape. And the cavaliers, of course, seem to express concern over the student's close proximity to the art. The lighthearted nature of this 1955 work belies Rockwell's own reality. During an emotional year, Mary modeled for the painting's portrait while under treatment for depression at the nearby Austin Riggs Center in Stockbridge. In addition, the couple's youngest son, Peter, was severely injured in a fencing accident at college. After 4 days at the hospital, Rockwell wrote with relief, "Peter out of danger." An art student at the time, oldest son Jarvis posed as the young man, looking a bit too intently at the flirtatious portrait. Art Critic is one of Rockwell's most popular and extensively analyzed works. His photographer, Bill Scoville, believed that it gave him the most trouble and agony of any. He had a terrible time finishing it, he said. At least 13 different charcoal and color studies preceded the finished painting, and here you see Rockwell in his studio surrounded by all of them. Remarkably created just to appear on the cover of a magazine that would be on the stands for 1 week. Similarly themed, Rockwell's 1946 painting Framed invites the viewer to ponder what happens when patrons vacate museums and artworks are left to their own devices. In this painting, a security guard has inadvertently framed himself as impressionist and historical paintings look on from the wall behind him. Fireman also relies upon this favorite Rockwell pictorial device, utilizing a frame within a frame to convey a layered message. Published on the cover of the Post in 1944, the year after a catastrophic fire destroyed his Arlington, Vermont studio, complete with his costume reference and prop collections, Fireman plays a visual trick on the viewer. Using trompe-l'oeil techniques, Rockwell releases a stream of smoke from a smoldering cigar left on the mantle below, to the dismay of the 1890s era firefighter who is trapped within his frame. On the lookout for props, Rockwell purchased an antique gilt frame for $1 in a junk shop. It was empty, he said. I felt it had to be filled. So you see the frames in this picture and the pictures in the frame. Legends of mermaids and mermen have enchanted humans for millennia. In the journal Christopher Columbus kept during his voyage of 1492 to 93, he recorded testimony from a crew member who claimed to have seen mermaids. English explorer Henry Hudson's 1608 logbook contains a similar account. These wonders of the sea, long a staple in literature, surfaced frequently in the golden age of illustration, about 1880s to 1920s. In the works of such artists as Howard Pyle, Edmund Dulac, and Arthur Rackham, all of whom Rockwell admired, Rockwell's Mermaid, a whimsical fantasy and his only nude for publication, builds upon the tradition. During his student years, Rockwell sometimes escaped to the seaside resort of Provincetown, Massachusetts, where he studied with painter Charles Webster Hawthorne and took the opportunity to work directly from nature. The idea for Mermaid formed from his memories of these early experiences. Following his previous post cover of a prim bride-to-be and her fiancé in a somber New England town hall, Mermaid, with its sea breezes, white sand, and rosy-cheeked nymph, was a refreshing diversion. Walter E. Merchant, an 81-year-old Gloucester, Massachusetts lobsterman, posed for the painting. But imagining the turmoil that might ensue if a neighbor were to appear as a nude female protagonist, Rockwell wisely hired a professional model from New York. Oh, I'm sorry. For the fishtail, he purchased a 12-pound pollock from the Berkshire Fish Company, and after photographing it, gave it to his neighbor, John Malumphy, who served it as his restaurant for 2 days. Rockwell was disappointed with the reproduction of the painting, which was published on August 20th, 1955, because he felt that his wispy clouds, designed to give the picture a mystical effect, were lost in the printing. Some readers called the cover obscene, but most found it humorous and delightful. Completely suspending disbelief, perhaps due to Rockwell's convincing portrayal, one wrote and noticed an egregious error, explaining, this is a quote, "It is well known to all competent marine biologists that the species, Aqua Homo sapiens, to which the mermaid belongs, is warm-blooded and mammalian, in contradiction to fishes, which are neither. As would be expected, a mermaid's tail is very similar to that of any other marine mammal, such as a seal, and has a smooth skin covered with soft fur, not scales." So as usual, Rockwell was being corrected by his audience, which he often was. In Lunch Break with a Knight, Rockwell's final narrative cover illustration for the Saturday Evening Post, the lines between fact and fiction are again creatively crossed. Published in 1962, when the magazine sought to present itself as a modern publication in changing times, this witty anecdotal work was a refreshing reminder of an aesthetic that has all but passed. Nestled among the mounted knights in a museum's hall of arms and armor, a weary night watchman, bathed in moonlight, his feet dangling from his perch, takes time out for a dinner break. Little does he know that he is being warily observed by the grand horse on whose pedestal he rests. During the American 20th century, the profusion of print media supported the work of numerous talented illustrators who, in concert with the literary and commercial establishments, were purveyors of imagination and fantasy. Rockwell's ability to look beyond the surface of things into the hearts, minds, and imaginations of his readers offered a vision that set him apart. Thank you very much, everybody. I think with that, we will take a little bit of a break, and I would suggest that we come back at 10:30, which is in about 7 minutes, and we will look forward to getting started with Ruth and Jane. Okay? Thank you, everybody.